Psalms 30:1 through 32:11. Devotional focus verse. I will instruct thee and teach thee in the way which thou shalt go. I will guide thee with mine eye. Be ye not as the horse, or as the mule, which have no understanding, whose mouth must be held in with bit and bridle, lest they come near unto thee. Psalm 32:8 through 9. When Papa rode into the yard on old Jim, a dapple-gray horse, my siblings and I thought he had finally lost his mind. Unlike Papa's earlier equine purchases, this animal was clearly past his prime. However, my father loved horses, and he had saved this one from the glue factory to live out his last days in comfort and pleasure on our farm. Old Jim quickly became a part of the family, and we children loved to ride him. He seemed to know we were young and was very careful with us. My 10-year-old brother, being the oldest of the 5 of us, would lead Jim next to a stump that stood in the front yard, and we would all pile onto his back. Then our gentle giant would slowly plod around the yard as each of us, entertained by our imaginations, rode in rodeos, roped cattle on a roundup, or entered the bronco-busting arena. We were happy. We would holler, "Yippie, ki-yi," and swing imaginary ropes at phantom cows for an hour without growing weary. When old Jim got bored and tired of the games and the noise, he would head to the backyard and carefully but firmly dump us into a howling heap on the ground. He would then stand there with his eyes closed. Old he may have been, but that horse had a mind of his own. We chuckle at the thought of a horse with a mindset. However, in our focus verse, we are admonished not to be stubborn like a horse or mule that must be forced to go in the right direction by the control of a bit or bridle. As children of God, we should be led by the Spirit of God and be responsive to His teachings. He is faithful to instruct us, but we must be willing to submit and follow His leading. God watches over us and is concerned about each step we take. He will never lead us in a wrong direction. Let us be pliable, teachable, and willing to follow. Background information. Psalm 30. The superscription of Psalm 30 indicates that it was sung during the dedication of a house of David. There were 2 instances in which David dedicated a house: after the building of his palace, see 2 Samuel 5:11, and at the return of the Ark of the Covenant from the house of Obed-Edom to the tabernacle, see 1 Chronicles 16:1 through 7. This psalm could have been written for either of these 2 occasions. It is also possible that the subtitle was added to the already existing psalm at the time of the dedication of the temple built by King Solomon. This psalm and the temple have a connecting thread. Some Bible scholars suggest that Psalm 30 may have been written by David after God halted the plague at the threshing floor of Araunah. See 2 Samuel 24:15. The threshing floor later became the site of King Solomon's temple. If this setting is accepted, David's description of healing in verses 2 through 3 would refer to the plague that came upon the children of Israel as a result of his sin of numbering the people. David's healing would have been the removal of that plague. Other commentators suggest that the psalm is David's personal expression of praise for divine healing following a crisis of physical sickness. Whatever the case, the dire nature of the psalmist's condition is apparent in the strength of his language. He felt his soul had been on the verge of death. The pit, in verse 3, was translated from a word that is a common synonym for Sheol, the place of the dead. As the psalmist expressed gratitude for the divine touch, he cited the lesson learned. While sorrow and distress may last temporarily, ultimately God restores. See verse 5. Though prosperity had made him self-confident, David had realized the folly of his ways and had cried unto the Lord, who brought deliverance. As often occurs in the Psalms, David moved from prayer and praise to expectation, concluding this psalm by contrasting mourning and sackcloth to dancing and gladness, and expressing his desire to give thanks to God forever. Psalm 31. Psalm 31 is dedicated to the chief musician and is ascribed to David in the title. A prayer for deliverance from the effects of slander and a murderous plot, the psalm may have been written at the time of David's escape from the treacherous men of Keilah, see 1 Samuel 23, or during the rebellion of Absalom. As a result of the plot against him, described as a net that they have laid privily for me, see verse 4, David experienced grief and fear, and this affected him both spiritually and physically. His words alternate between lament and praise. David's allusion to lying vanities in verse 6 refers to idols. Vanity is a common Old Testament name for false gods. Verses 9 through 13 describe the crisis David faced and the despair he felt as a result. Verse 10 seems to indicate that a sense of guilt contributed to the psalmist's distress. He may have been reflecting back to the time of his sin with Bathsheba. See 2 Samuel 11, 4 through 17. In verses 14 through 18, however, David affirmed his confidence in God and committed his case to him. Verses 19 through 24 are an expression of praise and a concluding call to the saints to love God and be of good courage. Psalm 32. Psalm 32 is the second of the 7 poems identified as penitential psalms. It relates closely to Psalm 51. The superscription mascule, which means to instruct, indicates that it was a meditation designed to teach. The theme of the psalm is the joy of forgiveness. It is a lesson in salvation based upon David's own experience. The word translated transgression in verse 1 is the strongest and most serious of Old Testament words used to indicate personal wrongdoing. The inherent meaning is rebellion against divine authority. The word sin, in Hebrew chata, means missing the mark, while iniquity, avon, refers to depravity or the distortion of morals. When God forgives transgressions, the literal meaning is that He bears or carries away the sin. The word covered implies that sin is purposefully hidden or concealed by God, not by personal effort, as one would cover up something repulsive or offensive to one's sight. The phrase, imputeth not, means guilt is not charged or placed on the account of the doer. God has absolved it by His grace. The phrase, when I kept silence, see verse 3, refers to a state of unrepentance or refusal to confess. The result was that the writer was depleted both physically and mentally, and the hand of God was heavy upon him. He felt the convicting hand of God. The only cure was confession, which is described in verse 5. In verses 8 through 11, the psalmist assumed the role of instructor, admonishing his hearers to follow the guiding of God. The psalm concludes with an encouragement for the righteous to rejoice and shout for joy. Conclusion. We want to be sensitive to God's instruction and quick to obey His leadings.
Psalm 30. I will extol Thee, O Lord, for Thou hast lifted me up, and hast not made my foes to rejoice over me. O Lord my God, I cried unto Thee, and Thou hast healed me. O Lord, Thou hast brought up my soul from the grave, Thou hast kept me alive, that I should not go down to the pit. Sing unto the Lord, O ye saints of His, and give thanks at the remembrance of His holiness. For His anger endureth but a moment, in His favor is life, weeping may endure for a night, but joy cometh in the morning. And in my prosperity I said, I shall never be moved. Lord, by thy favor thou hast made my mountain to stand strong, thou didst hide thy face, and I was troubled. I cried to thee, O Lord, and unto the Lord I made supplication. What profit is there in my blood, when I go down to the pit? Shall the dust praise thee? Shall it declare thy truth? Hear, O Lord, and have mercy upon me, Lord, be thou my helper. Thou hast turned for me my mourning into dancing, thou hast put off my sackcloth, and girded me with gladness. To the end that my glory may sing praise to thee, and not be silent. O Lord my God, I will give thanks unto thee forever. Psalm 31. In thee, O Lord, do I put my trust, let me never be ashamed, deliver me in thy righteousness. Bow down thine ear to me, deliver me speedily, be thou my strong rock, for an house of defense to save me. For thou art my rock and my fortress, therefore for thy name's sake lead me, and guide me. Pull me out of the net that they have laid privily for me, for thou art my strength. Into thine hand I commit my spirit, thou hast redeemed me, O Lord God of truth. I have hated them that regard lying vanities, but I trust in the Lord. I will be glad and rejoice in thy mercy, for thou hast considered my trouble, thou hast known my soul in adversities. And hast not shut me up into the hand of the enemy, thou hast set my feet in a large room. Have mercy upon me, O Lord, for I am in trouble, mine eye is consumed with grief, yea, my soul and my belly. For my life is spent with grief, and my years with sighing, my strength faileth because of mine iniquity, and my bones are consumed. I was a reproach among all mine enemies, but especially among my neighbors, and a fear to mine acquaintance, they that did see me without fled from me. I am forgotten as a dead man out of mind, I am like a broken vessel. For I have heard the slander of many, fear was on every side, while they took counsel together against me, they devised to take away my life. But I trusted in thee, O Lord, I said, thou art my God. My times are in thy hand, deliver me from the hand of mine enemies, and from them that persecute me. Make thy face to shine upon thy servant, save me for thy mercy's sake. Let me not be ashamed, O Lord, for I have called upon thee, let the wicked be ashamed, and let them be silent in the grave. Let the lying lips be put to silence, which speak grievous things proudly and contemptuously against the righteous. O how great is thy goodness, which thou hast laid up for them that fear thee, which thou hast wrought for them that trust in thee before the sons of men. Thou shalt hide them in the secret of thy presence from the pride of man, thou shalt keep them secretly in a pavilion from the strife of tongues. Blessed be the Lord, for he hath showed me his marvelous kindness in a strong city. For I said in my haste, I am cut off from before thine eyes, nevertheless thou heardest the voice of my supplications when I cried unto thee. O love the Lord, all ye his saints, for the Lord preserveth the faithful, and plentifully rewardeth the proud doer. Be of good courage, and he shall strengthen your heart, all ye that hope in the Lord. Psalm 32. Blessed is he whose transgression is forgiven, whose sin is covered. Blessed is the man unto whom the Lord imputeth not iniquity, and in whose spirit there is no guile. When I kept silence, my bones waxed old through my roaring all the day long. For day and night thy hand was heavy upon me, my moisture is turned into the drought of summer. Selah. I acknowledge my sin unto thee, and mine iniquity have I not hid. I said, I will confess my transgressions unto the Lord, and thou forgavest the iniquity of my sin. Selah. For this shall every one that is godly pray unto thee in a time when thou mayest be found, surely in the floods of great waters they shall not come nigh unto him. Thou art my hiding place, thou shalt preserve me from trouble, thou shalt compass me about with songs of deliverance. Selah. I will instruct thee and teach thee in the way which thou shalt go, I will guide thee with mine eye. Be ye not as the horse, or as the mule, which have no understanding, whose mouth must be held in with bit and bridle, lest they come near unto thee. Many sorrows shall be to the wicked, but he that trusteth in the Lord, mercy shall compass him about. Be glad in the Lord, and rejoice, ye righteous, and shout for joy, all ye that are upright in heart.